qué pasó?
My name is Sajda Qureshi, and I would like to talk to you about lessons from Latin America. There's some very, very interesting things happening in the area of virtualization as it relates to global development. So let's get started. Global development has a number of very, very unique elements to it. It's global, of course, we know that, and that is something that has been taking place for many, many years. What is unique in our time is the way in which information systems are evolving globally, but also evolving to have an impact, and in particular, very specific outcomes that affect the lives of people. How do we live our lives in ways that are different? How are those lives made better? That is the concept of development. And it's measured really in terms of economic development, gross domestic product, income generation, the ability of people to have the money to be able to do the things they need to do. Amartya Sen actually gives us a very unique perspective on global development. Basically, development happens when people have the freedom to lead the lives they choose to live. Very important, because that encompasses the economic perspective. They have the income to pay for things that they need to pay for in order to achieve better livelihoods. Social development is something that actually has a very institutional component to it. It refers to the institutions of government, institutions of finance, institutions of healthcare. World Health Organization is a very important social development institution, as are institutions of labor, climate, and other government institutions, including the ones that we are all involved with, education and universities, research and development. These are all parts of social development. Human development is actually a lot more specific. Human development has to do with our personal health care, ability to be empowered using technology, has to do with our learning. E-learning mechanisms come under human development. Very unique, very specific, very much affecting the ability to lead better lives. Well-being. The Human Development Index of the United Nations Development Program has many, many variables, refers to the ability of people to stay healthy and have better lives. In terms of well-being, that is the measurement. And something very unique also has happened in the last couple of years. This concept of information systems has come together in this very, very unique way in what is known as digital development. Look up digital development. 52 international agencies came together about 5 years ago and said, we need to do digital development. The principles of digital development relate to everything that has to do with information systems. Design with the user, understanding the existing ecosystem, it's data-driven, open data systems, and in particular, building information systems for sustainability. The technologies that tend to come up the most, of course, is the mobile cell phone, but virtualization has a very unique role. Let's talk about that. Let's look at that in the context of what Latin America has to offer. But first, sustainable development. Sustainability is the development that satisfies the needs of the present without compromising the capacity of future generations, guaranteeing the balance between economic growth, care for the environment, and social well-being. This is the guiding principle behind the institution of social development. International agencies, governments basically say and feel they need to be following this definition. This came about in 1987 when the United Nations basically asked UNCTAD to present at the United Nations General Assembly basically a proposal for development. And this proposal for development is very encompassing, unique, and important because it has guided what we know to be development since 1987. Now that we understand what sustainable development is, let's just take a look at what is the concept of development and what we know. Just a quick historical overview before we get into the details here. 1944, this is after the Second World War, a group of countries got together and said, you know what? United States needed partners to work with, trade with. Europe was devastated. Europe needed to be built up, needed to be developed. The Marshall Plan was put together. My first aid packet that we know of came from the United States to Europe to help build it. And then there was the rest of the world. The rest of the world called the Third World. You can call it that was not the developed North versus underdeveloped South and developing countries. These are the terms that came out of the understanding that there are a group of countries that need to be developed while others probably don't need to be. Escobar's work is very, very helpful in helping us understand the creation of the Third World. In his book, Escobar talks about encountering development, the making and unmaking of the Third World. This is the time when Latin America was actually doing very well, economically, socially, as well as in terms of its human development. Not the rest of the world so much. Let's see what happened. So I talked about the Marshall Plan. That was a development aid to Europe, began an era of what we now call modernization. So modernization has to do with technological knowledge, tools, and techniques developed in the West, this is North America and Europe, that should be used to develop economies that are poor. Institutions were put together to enable countries that are not modern to become modern, hence giving up the knowledge that kept them sustainable. In 1987, the Berlin Report of the World Commission of the Environment and Development came up with our common future that was presented to the General Assembly and gave us the definition for sustainable development. Very important. 1970 was the deregulation, free trade, and market capitalism that gave rise to what we have today, the rise of non-governmental organizations to help those in the poor countries, as Escobar would say, remain poor. How can you compete when your basic resources are being taken away from you? Of course, I'm being very, very biased here because Escobar is being very, very influential in my understanding of the Latin American story. In 2000, this was a very important time for the United Nations. They realized neoliberalism wasn't actually helping, wasn't actually offering free trade, and market capitalism wasn't actually giving us the benefits we hoped to get. So in 2000, Sustainable Development, the Millennial Development Goals, and Sustainable Development Goals later on in 2005 or 6 came together, 2010 were developed to help give the countries of the world some goals to be developed, more modern. Now, what does it mean to be modern? Well, Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennium Development, Sustainable Millennium Development Goals came in 2003 through the World Summit of the Information Society in Geneva, the Declaration of Principles of Action, and then in 2005, the Tunis Commitment, an agenda for the Information Society, basically came with the realization that the internet was a very powerful force in enabling countries to become developed without any support from institutions like the United Nations or the World Bank. Now, Escobar had already enlightened us by then and said, well, the World Bank has been offering, quote unquote, developing countries of the South and underdeveloped southern countries with huge loans. Argentina is a great example. Was building a supersonic jet in the 60s and now is purchasing supersonic jets. How? Well, The people of these countries are taxed. The poor farmers are taxed to pay for loans that the World Bank, through the countries of the North, are providing to the South. Escobar gives us some insight into this. Well, if you put a dam, a very, very expensive, multi-million, billion-dollar dam, taken through a loan from the World Bank, you take away the water from the sustainable practices and water from the communities that have for millennia lived off the land and kept the land producing the crops that they need to produce. Well, these dams take that away. And guess what? This country becomes dependent on the North for its sustainable development, for its sustainability. So, in 2015, the World Economic Forum declares the term developing world outdated. Of course, Escobar has succeeded in enlightening us. And the World Bank removes the developing country from its data classification. So let's see what happened. Let's take a look. So I want to take us to a Mayan village. Escobar tells us about the sustainable practices of the villages in the Mayan communities. He talks about how they live off the land, they keep their rivers pure so they can drink from their waters, and they also have farming practices that continue to keep the forests lush while offering them the crops that they need to survive. Sustainable development has been taking place long before 1987. And the Mayan villages basically are testament to that. Let's look a little further into this. So the sustainable techniques have been around for a while, right? Okay. Well, let's take a look at what the role is of information and communication technology as it relates to sustainable development, right? So according to The Economist, mobile phones have transformed the lives of the poor world. For every 100 mobile phones, the gross domestic product of a particular country grows by 0.8%. That's huge. This was in 2009. This was after the first crash, the global economic crash that would have left us all in poverty. Well, something interesting happened. Let's take a look. There were greater levels of internet diffusion are also associated with greater levels of voice accountability, and the greater levels of voice accountability are associated with lower levels of government corruption. I cite a paper from the Journal of Information Technology for Development, and a number of authors, including Cock and Gaskins, Balyamun Lutz as well, have said that corruption is basically a problem. And we know this. It's not necessarily corruption in those countries, but corruption also outside those countries affect the ability of a country to do well. So the internet diffusion apparently enables corruption to be limited. And Martha Garcia Rule actually, in her studies, found that corruption can be reduced through greater transparency. You'll find her paper in IT for Development. 5 emerging economies in Latin America. In 5 emerging deregulation is not enough to affect efficient ICT expansion. And Wanyama and Murakowski in 2010, also an IT for Development paper, argue that existing conditions, economic factors, human capital, geography, and civil infrastructure must also be considered. So a couple of other things are at play here when we talk about development, sustainable development as it relates to ICT, information communication technologies. Now let's take a look at Latin America and the Caribbean. This is the Latin American Information Center at the University of Texas. Has given me some data to work with. So we've got the Caribbean, which is a group of very, very beautiful little islands, wonderful opportunity for tourism. Then we've got Central North America, which has Mexico, a very, very interesting and powerhouse as it relates to what's happening in the United States. Some believe the United States would not be able to function without the labor, human capital, and raw materials from Mexico. Interesting thought. And then, of course, South America, we've got Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil and Chile powerhouses in of themselves. Not to mention the others, but I will focus on a few for the purpose of this particular presentation. So here we have Latin America and the Caribbean. Let's take a quick look at this map. Mexico, as you can see, is the border to a very large country, the United States. But take a look at Brazil. Look at how large that country is. Let's look at this a little better further. I want to take us to Mexico. I love Mexico. Mexico has offered me insight into multiple cultures, but also let's take a look at what's happening in Mexico, something that many countries in the world are suffering from. The divide between the rich and poor continues, and yet they live side by side. We live in a pandemic that has affected, unfortunately, the poor more than it has the rich, unequally, because, of course, the inequitable distribution of resources has made it impossible for people to be able to survive given the resources that are available to them, while others have, very few people, have had a larger portion of those resources. That is unfortunate. However, here's where ICT comes in. You see a lovely Mexican woman, possibly of Mayan origin, has a cell phone. Now notice earlier I gave you some data on how the cell phones are actually increasing the wealth of a nation. Waverman's study from Harvard was very, he's an economist from Harvard, that has told us that for some reason, and this is through no policy of any government or international agency, cell phones are enabling people to lead the lives they choose to lead. How is that? Well, let's take a look. You've got a market here, right? People, you've got tourists in the market, you've got people, local Mexican people in the market, and then you have a young woman, maybe a tribal teenager, who has the ability now to sell her goods and services, and now also has a number where she can be reached. That says a lot to the ability of people to lead the lives they choose to live. Now, Mexico itself is also putting an enormous amount of effort into building infrastructures, especially in rural communities. Cities, of course, have great infrastructure. Here you see the infrastructures that are being put in place in Mexico. But to what end? We have great telecommunication networks, yet Mexico still needs to do a better job, according to OECD. Yet the telecommunication infrastructure is there. But at the same time, how does the information and communication technology enable growth, enable human and social economic development? Let's take a look. I got these pictures from Guillermo. Thank you, Guillermo. These are pictures of micro-entrepreneurs, small farmers, a Mayan villager who's basically selling her goods at, I think, a resort or a hotel. At the same time, the small micro-entrepreneurs and small medium-sized enterprises are actually able to choosing to lead the lives they choose to live. They're able to do so by being able to sell their goods and services, being able to be found, and being able to understand what is needed, and be able to sell their goods and services through being connected through the mobile cell phone. Those are the little case studies that help us understand how income is generated through the use of the mobile cell phone. So Mexico is a great example because I love Mexico, and I can tell you lots of wonderful stories about Mexico. But let's move on. Let's take a look. I want to take us to Brazil now. Brazil, again, this is a favela. And IT for Development author David Namer has done a lot of work in favelas in Brazil. And he found that and he has amazing papers in which he has found that the use of information and communication technologies in the favelas of Brazil can probably teach us a little bit about how these small communities can actually bring themselves out of poverty and possibly thrive through the use of information communication technologies. David Namer talks about the use of social networks and the use of social networks through, of course, the cell phone. He talks about how the favelas also enable enterprise to people to find each other, and how private enterprise and small and medium-sized enterprises, micro enterprises can grow, and people can find the things they need by connecting with each other. A very unique perspective and a very important perspective that helps us understand how communities are coming out of their predicament. Brazil is also the second largest producer of food in the world. Second to the United States, Brazil provides the rest of the world with food, livestock, as well as in particular wheat and corn. What you have here is a picture from an article from the World Economic Forum on how smart farming is transforming Brazil. And it's also feeding the world. So this author, Daniel Carreira, tells us that what we are seeing here is a cattle rancher in the arid north of Brazil's Minas Gerais state. Brazilian farmers like him supply 23% of the world's cattle, earning $31 billion US dollars from the lucrative beef industry. In the past, water scarcity has made it increasingly difficult for many of them to meet the growing demand. But now a more sustainable farming method is helping Salas and his fellow ranchers to bring overgrazed land back to life. Remember sustainable practices we talked about? They're coming back. I have recovered, again, Salas tells us, that he's recovered more than 100 hectares of degraded pasture in less than 1 year. He also, thanks to a farming method known as the integrated crop livestock forest production system. It's called an integrated system, that basically they combine pastures, forests, and fields in the same area. Brazil is an important example of how large chunks of land that were previously arid, could not be farmed, are now helping Brazil feed the world and its own people. Very important. But that's not just that, not just the small farmers. This is another area that is Brazil's big success story. What you're seeing here is vast part of Brazil that used to be arid and now has been taken over by Brazil Agro. Brazil Agro is a company that buys and modernizes neglected fields, uses radio transmitters to keep track of the weather, runs SAP, an ERP system, software, employs 300 people under a gaucho from southern Brazil, has 200 kilometers, 124 miles of new roads crisscrossing the fields, and at harvest time resounds to a thunder of lorries. This is from The Economist. The Economist reports that all this is happening in Piauí, the Timbuktu of Brazil, a remote, somewhat lawless area where the nearest health clinic is half a day's journey away, and most people live in a state of welfare payments. This is nothing short of miraculous. What you're seeing is all these combine harvesters connected wirelessly to an SAP ERP system. This is a very, very important innovation that is helping parts of Brazil become very economically productive, offering jobs and opportunities to people who used to be on welfare. Artificial intelligence. FarmGo is an example of artificial intelligence. A Moringa-based startup offers tools for rural agricultural producers they've never had access to in the past, like digital harvest monitoring. By pinpointing the exact location of low performance in the field, a precision down to a few meters, these technologies help producers make more informed decisions about their resource use. Again, an important innovation powering Brazil's agriculture. Biotechnologies have been important. Brazilian startups are accelerating between searching for effective integrated pest management systems that combine traditional insecticides and pesticides with modern biological methods by using natural materials, including various animals, plants, bacteria, and minerals to balance chemical-based methods for deterring pests and preventing crop disease. So increasing productivity and the ability through sustainable farming of the crops to be more profuse. Brazil is quite a powerhouse in of itself. Economic, human, and socio-economic development. Chile's farming, and especially its salmon farming industry, is nothing short of a miracle. In the 90s, some Chilean farmers who had lost their land as a result of a hurricane got in touch with some Norwegian salmon scientists in Norway through the internet, basically, and learned from the Norwegian scientists how to farm salmon. So learning these salmon farming techniques from Norway through searching the internet and getting in touch through the internet with Norwegian scientists, Chilean farmers were able to start farming salmon. Now, in 2009, Chile had done so well in salmon farming, had become the second largest producer of salmon in the world after Norway, and was invited in 2009 to become a member of the OECD. Nothing short of a miracle. Let us take a look and see what happened. So the original salmon farming techniques came from Norway. You can see them right here. Offshore farming, not on the land. That's a very unique innovation. And that innovation continued. A patent was developed in Chile. What you're seeing is Chilean development Ocean Arcs Tech received a patent for its Ocean Arcs offshore salmon farming technology. Again, increase in production, increase in the ability of the salmon farmers to make money and therefore also help people around them make money. Increase in GDP. Let's take a look. So, invited to join the OECD in 2009, here's some ICTs that have spurred the growth of Chile. The Washing Institute system makes changes to the net management system for the entire fish production while reducing the costs. Very interesting. But in addition to salmon farming, Chile has been very, very specific in its investment in ICT infrastructures, as well as the ability of its population to basically take any nearshoring and offshoring opportunities that may be available. So as a result, the ICT sector contributes to the agriculture, livestock, fishing, and manufacturing, commerce, and transportation communication of Chile. Very interesting example of how Chile continues to grow using ICTs. So here's some examples of how we can do research that does help us understand what are the ways in which a country may continue to develop. So we can, of course, do country studies, but there are regional studies too that help us, and world studies. I'll just get through these quickly. Feel free to look at them. But I did want to share a study that I actually presented in EMSIS last year, where one of the things that have been very, very interesting to find in Latin America is the use of Bitcoin, and which is, of course, connected to internet penetration and the Human Development Index. And what we found that there were a lot of countries in the largest cluster, that was our first cluster, basically had mostly Latin American countries in them. And these countries, were Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and of course Colombia, and Mexico. And what you will find in these countries is that they represent variations to the Bitcoin mining business model, which is the process by which computers can form transactions on the network, turning into big business with advanced tools being developed to manage these systems. So mining seems to be taking off in these countries while also contributing to human development in those Latin American countries. I wanted to share that with you because at an aggregate level, we see that there is growth and human development, economic and human development taking place from the virtualization and the ICT technologies that are being implemented. And I just wanted to show you how this all comes together. As you can see, Brazil and Argentina, Chile and as well as are very much in this space, as well as Mexico. Very interesting to see what the other countries are. You've got China in there as well, South Africa as well. Very interesting. I'd like to know what you think. Any thoughts would be very, very welcome. Well, having said this, I think I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to give you the references that I've been using in this talk. Feel free to get into the Information Technology for Development Journal and take advantage of enormous amount of research that has taken place in this area. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
¿Y qué pasó?